an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Drachenfels, Prologue through Part 1, Chapter 3. In this section, we meet Genevieve. We meet a whole party of people, actually, some of whom may still be alive by the time we get to the present day. I am very... concerned isn't the right word. I feel a little in over my head. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. Kyle says in the chat, what a coincidence to be reading this around the return of Twilight. Yeah, it's actually funny because I've been listening to to Midnight Sun, the audio book. And it's an interesting difference to see like the type of vampire that doesn't even want to say their own like species name versus this vampire who is actively researching what kinds of vampires exist in the world. This is a very, very different vibe, not just because of the setting and whatnot. So first of all, I want to ask about what the deal is with this being titled like a Warhammer novel, because that sounds to me like a video game, but I don't know if I have that right. I feel like, Kyle, you may have sent me an email about this a ways back, and I have just forgotten by now. But this seems like it sort of ties into a world that maybe already exists, and I'm just not familiar with that world. And also, this was written by a woman named Kim Newman, but it says underneath writing as Jack Yeville. And I am very curious what happened to the fact that she was like writing. Oh, Kyle says Kim Newman is a man. Oh, okay. I never heard Kim as a man's name. I am curious why he wrote under a different name, but then let everybody know that he was writing under a different name. There's a lot about this that I don't, like the origins of this that I don't know or understand. Kyle says nope to the Warhammer as a video game thing. So maybe I have just heard about this series in the ether and assumed that it was a Warhammer thing. That was like the name of a video game. He says Jack Yeville was the pseudonym way back when this was published, and it got re-released. He used real name. Okay. Yeah, and I just want to know why. Why did he write under a pseudonym to begin with? Was he doing one of those things where he was sort of famous for something else, and he wanted to like let people wanted this work to stand on its own merits without relying on his famous name? Was he somebody who wrote in a very different genre, and so he felt that if people came to a book expecting that genre and said they got horror, they were going to be upset by it? He says Warhammer is a tabletop war game setting. Sorry, the note was to Kim Newman being a woman. Ah, got you. So Warhammer is a game. Okay. I thought that I had heard of it, like it had like a vague echo of familiarity, but I really don't know much about gaming at all. Well, we can be talking about tabletop gaming when I say that, or we can be talking about video gaming, and I really bare minimum knowledge really on most. Okay, so this is maybe like set in the world of the tabletop game then. So is this like, and Kyle, I assume that you know this, but you may not, and if not, that's okay. Is this like if somebody set their book in like a D&D sort of universe where they're using existing races that exist in the game and like the sort of the framing of how magic works in that universe, and it's sort of like a fan fiction within that universe, I'm assuming. So, and he says, I figured the setting was generic enough and the book was self-contained enough that it would be fine. Yeah, and it's not like I didn't have trouble understanding it, but I just wondered about that because it's like not difficult for me to get my footing exactly, but it does have the feel of there is much more to this world that I don't know. And I don't feel like the book assumes I do. It's not a problem of the book being like, you should have read all of these other things in order to get this. It doesn't feel that way at all. But there's just a sense of, if you have background in other things, you might not need these explanations, and they're very like cursory. And I am fine with that, actually, in terms of like, I don't want everything like explained up front in a big info dump. So the way that this goes along worked for me. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to get that straightened out. He says, not so much a fan fiction as an official tie-in. Oh, okay. So it's official. Okay, cool. So we go to Genevieve's point of view. Genevieve is a vampire. He says, Warhammer isn't D&D so much as a big army of plastic dudes and fight your friends type games. So much of the story/lore comes from novels. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Huh. That's a really different thing than I've heard of before, but that sounds kind of cool. I could see that being really fun, actually, to have like something that's a game that is directly tied in with novels in a way that it's not like, you know, a Harry Potter board game where it's the novels were the thing and then you made a game to sort of go with them. But having something that's meant to sort of be like, what's the word? Symbiotic, and they work together. I think that's a really neat idea. Interesting. So Genevieve is a vampire. And when we go to her point of view, the very first thing that we get is that she is in the middle of being stabbed, which is a hell of a way to start shit off. I really did enjoy this. It got my attention right away. And she realizes that the knife is edged with silver. And she has a very specific bad reaction to silver. And we soon find out that this is a very traditional vampire like mythology here. At least she is. We wind up finding out about other vampires who all run the gamut of different types. But she, you know, sleeps during the day. She can't stand the touch of silver. Garlic is also unhealthy for her. There was another thing that I'm trying to remember all of the things. Stake through the heart. And we find out later that there are other vampires who have to be placed in a box full of dirt from their homeland, which is a really old one, or else they can't be safe from the sun. I am a huge fan, don't get me wrong, of upending tropes and things like that for mythical creatures and supernatural creatures. But there is something sort of comforting and refreshing after having read so many things which sort of upset the mythology that we know, of going back to the basics and all of the things that you've heard all being true. Eventually, we find out that there are still vampires that turn into wolves and bats and sentient, like, clouds and shit. And I am all about it. So she hisses in response. The wet hole in her side closed, tingling. Blood trickled down the inside of her breeches. So we find out that she is able to, like, from here we get that she heals quickly. But later on, we find out that she could regrow an entire limb. It could take a while, so she prefers not to lose the limb. But were that to happen to her, it would only be a temporary setback. It would take a year or so. But considering how long she's been alive, that's really not that long. And it says she heard herself hissing and knew that her face, the face she had not seen for 6 centuries. Which, again, it took me a minute. I was like, why hasn't she seen her face? And then I was like, oh my God, a vampire disappears in a mirror. Which I never really thought about how deeply inconvenient that would be. But that sucks. Like, I would love to know, if a vampire puts a face mask on, if they stand in front of the mirror, I'm assuming that their face mask also disappears. But what if there's just a face mask hovering in midair? But I'm just thinking about, you can't wear makeup, or you'd have to put it on blind. You can't tell if you've got a zit or something in your teeth. Oh, what a bummer. I would hate that. The pass they had come to, this stony and unfruitful spot high in the gray mountains, was a filthy place. It was late afternoon, and she was still slowed by the sun. Otherwise, Yueli would never have dared strike at her. So, the thing that everybody assumes, because there is a big fight here, is that Yueli basically turned on all of them. But it becomes quickly clear that at some point, Yueli either was replaced with this thing, or was this thing from the beginning. And nobody's really certain. I feel kind of bad for the guy, because he doesn't seem... in either case, he's been taken advantage of, killed in order to be used as this puppet. And that sucks. The traitor was growing in death. At least his skeleton and insides were expanding. His dwarf shell and clothes split and showed raw pink and purple through great tears. Human-sized bones twisted on the ground, their wet contents pouring through the remaining ragged strips of Yueli's skin. Yueli's still glaring eyes popped, and maggots writhed in their sockets, spilling over stretched tight cheeks and into his beard. His tongue slithered out of his mouth like a strangling snake, twisted down impossibly long toward his chest, and then died. Oh my God, you guys. I put this book on almost immediately after waking up this morning to listen to, because I got the audiobook, which I actually have been really liking. I was not prepared for this first thing in the morning while I'm making my breakfast. It is very jarring. It's a lot. And we grow to find out as this band of people sort of gets introduced to us. And I say people in the loose sense. The people, I use the word people to encompass sentient beings, essentially. Whether they are human is beside the point. So we have a dwarf named Manesh, I think. And then we have this guy, Rudy, who I believe is a human. I will definitely lose track of all of these people's names, so everybody forgive me, but I'll try and do my best as we continue. And Genevieve is aware that Yueli has saved her life a couple times, and she's sort of wondering, did he save my life only to kill me at the appropriate time, or was he not always in service of Drachenfels? And Drachenfels BT Dubs is the name of a real bad guy. Drachenfels is not here to play. This is not somebody who's extra cruel and just kind of wants to take over the world in their way. This is a person who, it's imagine a battery that needs evil to be fully charged. And Drachenfels needs human pain, and I say human because those are the most frequent victims that we hear about, but it's not necessarily confined to human. Drachenfels is a creature that I do not want to call a person that requires the pain and suffering of others to become fully charged. So it's not just like, this is somebody who all of their aims to dominate the world come before doing the right thing, or that they're so ruthless or anything like that. The pain and the horror is the point. That's what they are after. And we find out about some really horrifying shit that happened a little bit later, as well as incredibly, I hate to use the word, but honestly, imaginative types of torture that he subjects his enemies to, and his victims are almost all, as we also find out, in his clutches still. It does not seem like a lot of people are simply killed and then they get to rest because their soul passes on. He seems to hold on to their souls, which adds a whole other fucking layer of horror to the thing, because even in death you're not done, which sucks. Anything that I've read in which there is sort of like a necromantic power, anything that implies that death isn't an escape, I resent deeply, because to me that should really be it. I thought we all agreed that the one thing we could depend on is that death brings us to the sweet end of all of our suffering. And when that's not even true, when you can't depend on that, that's like a breach of social contract that I really thought was kind of, we had all settled on it. So she's thinking about this adventure, and we get a little backstory here. It says, that is what it had seemed when Oswald von Königswald, eyes ablaze, had recruited her in the Crescent Moon. She had been working in the tavern at Altdorf, trading one drink for another for 100 years or so. Longevity brings a heavy burden of tedium. Genevieve, suspended eternally between life and death since the Dark Kiss, had been willing to do almost anything to relieve her boredom. Just as Anton Veit was willing to do almost anything for gold crowns, or Sir Jehan for a chance to increase his learning, Rudy Wegener to expand his glory, or Weekstead Heinroth to achieve his cherished revenge. And Oswald? What was Oswald, Crown Prince Oswald, Genevieve reminded herself, willing to do almost anything for? An adventure, a quest. So they find out that Sir Jehan was a scholar, evidently. We don't meet him because he is already dead. The dwarf bit clean through his throat to the bone. So they have to head on and leave this dude's body behind. I will say, I understand when in a story people are like, we have to bury him, we have to pay the proper respects. But I really appreciate when that isn't a thing that a crew is going to stop and do. I feel like it's a combination of things here. First of all, I have this sense of urgency that to me is like, I don't think they would want us to stop. We're on a mission here. Time is of the essence. We just got attacked. I believe they would want us to fucking heave ho a little bit. But there's also, this tells me something about these people. They have each other's backs, but they don't seem to have an affection for each other that goes beyond what they need to accomplish their goal. This isn't a pack of closely knit friends who are all like, emotionally entangled. This is a party of loose knit people who are all motivated to achieve the same objective. And that's pretty much it. And so when somebody dies, leaving them is just kind of, it's not a big deal to any of them. So we go to the description, the explanation of Constant Drachenfels, the great enchanter. who had been old, had been ancient, long before the first birth of Genevieve Sandrine Dupont du Lac Dijon. I really don't think I said that right. And that she never allowed herself to forget had been 638 years ago. So this person, I don't like to say that, this creature is like 1,000 years old. At least. At least. In true life, Genevieve's home had been the city of Paravon in the east of Bretonnia, where her father was minister to the first family, and her sisters were counted among the greatest beauties of a court renowned through the known world for its great beauties. So, I'm assuming that she is also a great beauty, because chances of all of her sisters being like some of the greatest beauties of the world and her not being doesn't seem to be that likely, but that's not particularly mentioned. Drachenfels had been more often abroad among men in those days and wont to show his metal-masked face in the courts and palaces of Bretonnia and the Empire. The stories were fresher then. Tales were told in a whisper of his vast debauches, of his inconceivable crimes, of his devastating rages, of his titanic sorceries, of his terrible revenges, and of his single defeat. Drachenfels had been one of the powers of the world. She supposed, though half forgotten, he still was. He had only been bested once, at the hands of Sigmar Heldenhammer. Strange to think that Sigmar had been deemed a man then, a hero, but still a man. Now, the priests called him the patron deity of the Empire. Sigmar was gone, no one knew where, but the monster he had once humbled was still here. The evil of Drachenfels was still very much with the world. So I found this really interesting, that Drachenfels is sort of like waning a little bit by the time they come at him here. Which sort of explains why they are able to apparently defeat him. I say apparently because it seems like there is some other piece of the puzzle that is still not dealt with based on the information that she gets that draws her away at the end of this section. A girl of 12, 4 years before the Dark Kiss, Genevieve had seen Drachenfels in person. He rode through Paravon with his army of the dead, bedecked in gorgeous silks, wearing his mask of gold. The heads of the first family's militia captains bobbed open-mouthed on pikes. An assassin dashed from the crowds and was torn to pieces by Drachenfels' rotting lieutenants. Demons danced in the air, bearing away pieces of the martyred daggerman. Genevieve hid behind her sister's skirts, but got a good look all the same. So, this dude is incredibly fucked up. One of the men that's on this mission with her in this party is trying to avenge his 2 young sons, who basically, from the sound of things, it says had sport with them. I believe that they were raped, his 2 little boys, before they were murdered in front of him. So just to give you an idea of the kind of really horrifying torture that this book is totally willing to get into. Like, this isn't just, oh, he murdered a bunch of people. There's something clean about just murdering a bunch of people. It's when you decide to do that kind of extra shit because you want that cruelty and torment, that is when we start getting into the real deep fucked upness of it. And it's just, the list of people that this man has killed. I mean, he's been around for, like I said, at that point, at least 1,000 years. Maybe longer, and I can't imagine how many millions, billions, perhaps, this person is responsible for killing. And she thinks about how, other than what's been going on, like, lately with occasionally remembering her parents, she doesn't think about them that often because it has been so long, and her memories of them aren't super clear. Occasionally somebody's face will pop into her head, like, really clearly, but it sort of fades, which I can totally imagine happening. That already happens as you get older, only living, for several decades. So we get also an information about Shandagnok, these names. Shandagnok, with his dark eyes and plaited beard, his needle-like teeth and tales of the world's youth. She received the dark kiss and was born a second time into this half-life. Eventually, this dude who turned her got hunted down and killed 300 years ago. And I can't tell whether or not the dark kiss was something that she wanted and he gave her, whether it was something that she was forced into, or whether it's something that she didn't quite grasp what was happening at the time and so sort of invited it because she didn't have a full understanding and now she does. And we may not find that out for a little while, or maybe it's just not super important. There is a feeling to her of so much time having passed that at this point, it seems like sort of moot. Whether or not she wanted it, it's been, 600 years. Oh, well, and she had been apparently 16 years old, I think, when she was turned. So she still looks super young, but she's been alive for fucking centuries now. And she wondered if he felt the same suppressed kinship for her that she felt for Drachenfels. There were songs that they alone of all the world would recognize, once famous names that they alone knew, extinct animals, the taste of whose meat they alone could recall. Probably he did not feel for her. Probably he was only dimly aware of her. She was what she was, at best the cousin of humanity, but Drachenfels was beyond even that. He had ceased to be any kind of a man long before he rode into Paveron. The face he kept beneath his bland collection of metalwork masks would not remotely resemble anything else that drew breath. So, it says she'd followed his career, kept a mental note of the kingdoms sacked and bled dry, the plagues unleashed, the tributes exacted, the demons set free. He had been quiet for a few centuries now in his impregnable fortress. And there's something really interesting here that got my attention when I was listening to the audiobook, and apparently it's been highlighted by a few people in the Kindle as well. A lot of people think that maybe he's dead, but it seems like he's just apparently being noticed by some. The wizards who frequented the Crescent Moon would talk about him sometimes, about the disturbances he was making in that sphere beyond time and space, where the greatest of enchanters venture in search of the vast principal beings of the universe. Which, I really want to know what the fuck it is that he's trying to do out there. Who is he trying to get in touch with? Is he attempting to ascend? Is he trying to be a god? Like, it sounds like he's as close to a god as you're going to get, still living on this earth. And by this earth, I mean her earth, not our earth, clearly. And she assumes that he's probably growing in his power, because when you are an immortal, age does not seem to diminish you the way that people think it does, because they're so used to dealing with mortals aging. And so she believes that he is probably more powerful now than he has been. And he's simply not acting out the way that he had been. So that's interesting. Like, is it because he's trying to, like, venture into these strange in-between places that he's focusing so much on that he doesn't have time to wreak the havoc on the physical plane that he had? So she has been, as we've mentioned, recruited by Prince Oswald. And Prince Oswald has an interesting sort of like background to him. He is extremely fucking intelligent. One of those people who just sort of shows up his tutors all the time. His father apparently tried to like outlaw prostitution, to which he was like, "Oh, really? Are you? Because I seem to remember this bitch that you've got at like our dinner table all the fucking time. So if you're going to do that, I'm assuming you're getting rid of her too." And everybody was like, "Oh shit." And his father didn't go through with it. And apparently he like even has published a volume of poetry. It's essentially. And when she met him, she was pretty impressed with him, and he offered his wrist for her to drink his blood. And evidently, as we find out later, this is not an uncommon thing. A lot of people who have admired her are totally down to get bit. Not necessarily killed, although sometimes they're fine with that too. And not necessarily turned. It just seems like a bit of a experience that some people are either interested in experiencing at all, or they get off on it in some way. And so they, go around trying to find vampires. And we talk about here, Anton Veit, the bounty hunter who cared for his weapons as others care for their women. And Oswald knew things about her that she herself had forgotten. He'd offered a chance for revenge. And she realizes that she doesn't really care about revenge. That doesn't hold any allure for her because of her, to kill her parents' killer. But Sigmar is the one whose children who were killed, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And he is somebody for whom that is a major motivation. And let's see, Kyle says Heinroth. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm getting so many names mixed up. These are all extremely unfamiliar names, so forgive me. That'll be a minute before I got this straightened out. But he has made a deal with himself that he will cut a scar into his flesh for every day that he does not avenge his sons. So he is covered with all of these like small lacerations. And that is pretty metal, honestly. So let's see. I'm trying to find, because there is so much. Oh my God, I forgot about this. So other people join their party eventually. And we one day they woke up to find Heinroth turned inside out with words carved into his bones. Go back now. That is horrifying. I can't even wrap my head around that. They find him turned inside out. What does that even look like? Oh, I hate it so much. This is the kind of thing that, like, if it happened on screen, you wouldn't get it. You'd be like, what in the fuck is going on? It would take very skilled CGI and a slow-mo showing of the event for you to really understand, oh, that's what's happening. Because your brain just can't handle thinking about it. Through it all, Oswald had been at their head, undaunted by each new horror, keeping his followers together, which in the case of Veit and the dwarves, or the licentious Erzbet and the fanatically ascetic Heinroth, hadn't been easy, and forever confident of the eventual outcome. Now, Conradin was dead, Sieur Jehan was dead, Heinroth was dead, Ueli was dead, and before the night was over, others, or maybe all, would be joining them. So we go into the actual castle, finally. And it is wild, this part, that I honestly, I can't lie, cackled a little bit. Like, I snorted and then just burst out laughing. There's this door that Stellan is saying that it's guarded by spells, and the prince asks, can you open it, Warlock? And Stellan's like, oh, of course. I don't understand why he's even bothering with something that's this easy, and basically does an Allahumora, like that's it. And he's like, see, I told you it was fine. And then it says, Then, Stellan the Warlock simply exploded. They were drenched in gore. The door hung with ribbons of cloth and meat. The stone walls dripped red for 10 feet behind them. Stellan's naked skeleton stood for a moment, still grinning, then collapsed. I don't want to find that hugely funny, but that's hilarious. That's so incredibly fucked up, but also such a great cap to him being so disdainful of the whole thing. Jesus Christ. Oh my God. So as this continues on, them like going through this castle, they eventually get to this spot where everybody begins to turn on one another. And she starts to realize that there is some sort of magic working on them to get them at each other's throats. And this is all sort of, it happens right after they come across this, this huge, what's the word I want? It's like a tapestry, I think. Sorry, there's somebody doing like workouts right outside my window. That has a depiction of this event that took place where apparently Drachenfels like promised that he had turned and changed and become a different man. And so everybody, like, of course, at the beginning of this was like, that doesn't sound like something that would happen. But a lot of time passes and he keeps on doing good deeds. He keeps on reaching out and performing like these charitable acts and being this benefactor. And he eventually says that he's going to turn his like terrifying castle into a shelter for people who don't have homes, yada, yada, yada. And that he wants to have this big event to commemorate this moment and this change of heart and celebrate with everybody. But they are all poisoned, and not even poisoned and killed. They're poisoned, and it's just enough to render them immobile, but they are still conscious and able to see, and they all have to bear witness to these horrible tortures before they eventually die of starvation with the feast still laid out in front of them. It's just about as terrible as you can imagine. Like, over and over again. You think of a thing and they're like, no, let's do this worst thing, actually. So everybody starts fighting, and she starts to get a bit of the bloodlust on her. And Oswald grabs her and slaps her across the face and looks at her and kisses her on the cheek. And she is able to calm herself down. And he goes to each of them and calms all of them down as well. And I really feel bad for this one particular girl, Erzbet. I think she might be, but yeah, she apparently has kind of like lost it by the time he's able to get to her and calm her down. And she was a dancer assassin. So that's a pretty dope thing. I don't remember if we hear whether or not she makes it to the other end of this alive, but that's always a fun thing to me, is people who are either dancers or acrobats, and they are also assassins. I know it's super cliche, but I still think it's really fun. So they continue on, and they are really beginning to flag. People are injured. They are suffering from the effect of whatever this magic is. And eventually they get to the heart of things. And the King of Darkness is sitting on his throne and is essentially like, oh shit, y'all are here, huh? I don't know if you really can pull that off. I mean, you can give it a shot, I suppose. And it says, Oswald came forward and his sword clashed on the enchanter's mailed arm. Drachenfels turned to look down on him. She felt herself dragged down, the insubstantial creatures surging up over her. She couldn't breathe. She could barely move her limbs. She was cold, her teeth chattering, and she was tired. Tired as she shouldn't be until dawn. She felt bathed in stinging sunlight, wrapped in bands of silver, smothered in a sea of garlic. Somewhere the hawthorn was being sharpened for her heart. Her mind fogged. She tasted dust in her throat and her senses dulled. Unconscious, she missed the battle all the ballads would be about. The battle that would be the inspiration for poets, minstrels, sculptors, and painters. The battle that would make Prince Oswald von Koningswald a hero famed throughout the old world. The battle that would cause some to see in the prince the very spirit of Sigmar reborn. The battle that would put an end to constant Drachenfels. And we don't get to see that battle either. We then move into Act 1. And jump ahead quite a bit. So we go to this fucking playwright isn't even quite an adequate word. He's like a director. Detlef Sierck. He is in a crazy amount of debt, in a kind of debt that is so insane that all of the other people in this debtor's prison are almost respectful of him, sheerly due to how much money he owes. Because for a lot of them, it's, 15 crowns, 2,000 crowns. And for him, I think it is 190,000 crowns, something like that. I know that it's said exactly many, many times here. It's 119,255 gold crowns, 17 shillings and 9 pence. So everybody just keeps reciting it because they just can't help be in awe. It's too much. There's no possible way of getting out of it is the thing. And we learn about what got him into this debt. It turns out that he basically was planning this enormous play. And that's not even quite an adequate word for it. It sort of reminds me of when you hear about the celebrations from, King Henry VIII, where there are 600 tents, 30 feet wide and 60 feet long, all made with cloth of gold. And there are fountains that are pouring wine. That sort of excess, but in this performance instead. And he says, the play that would, not to put too sharp a point on it, have earned back tenfold the meager cost of its staging. It was called The True History of Sigmar Heldenhammer, founder of the Empire, savior of the Reich, defier of the darkness. Detlef had written it on a commission for the Elector of Middenland. The epic was to have been staged in the presence of Emperor Karl Franz himself. Detlef had planned to call upon the full resources of 3 villages in the Middle Mountains for the production. The entire populations would have been drafted in to serve as extras. A castle of wood was to be erected and burned down during the course of the action, and wizards had been engaged to present state-of-the-art illusions during the magical sequences. So, yeah, this is an enormous production that he sinks a lot of money into and promises a lot of money for. And then there is an outbreak of plague amongst the extras. And, with what's going on right now, I was just like, yeah, that feels a little bit too close to home. We shouldn't really, especially considering it's the extras, So there are all of these people who are supposed to come to this huge event. And when it becomes public that plague has broken out, that is it. They are not coming. People are demanding their money back. And essentially, the pandemic put him out of business. That's kind of what happened. There had been considerable expenses already, and those who had laid out the 1,000 gold crowns he had been asking for a reserve ticket were clamoring for the refund of their money. Furthermore, the 3 villages were rumored to be clubbing together to petition the Assassins' Guild. And he explains to his cellmates about all of the amazing things that he was going to accomplish with this play. All of the scenes that were going to be incredibly over the top and dramatic, and just, this music that he had commissioned, written. And he goes on and on and on until somebody's finally like, oh my God, dude, shut the fuck up. Nobody cares, seriously. But honestly, they don't have anything else to do there. So what's he going to do? He's just going to tell his story. So they ask him, you had a visitor yesterday, didn't you? The fellow with the evil eye and the frightful twitch. And he says that was Grunlieb the Greasy. And then goes on to explain why this dude is absolute trash, why all of his acts are garbage, why all the people who work for him are pathetic clowns. And then says he had the nerve to propose I work for him. He wanted me to write jokes for him. And I love that he offers a penny a line. And Justice says, yeah, I don't know how many lines it would take to pay off 119,255 gold crowns, 17 shillings and 9 pence. But I don't think the Great Library at the university has that many lines in any of their books, like, all put together. So then Detlef, the chapter ends with him saying, do you think I'd make a good trustee? I don't even know what that word means. You know what? Let me see if trustee, like, is this somebody who, let me just look. Let's see what dictionary says. Having served for a long time and regarded as reliable or faithful, a prisoner who is given special privileges or responsibilities in return for good behavior. Maybe that's what he means. Do you think I would make a good one? And Kosinski laughed nastily, and he says it was just a thought. And then we leave this chapter. So then we go to Genevieve. And it has been quite a while since that battle that we were there with her to miss. I was going to say witness, but we don't. And she is in this convent. And we wind up finding out that the convent appears to be exclusively for vampires, unless I am mistaken. She's got a lot of vampires here with her at the very least, if it's not for, like, exclusively. And she is wondering what's going on in the world and realizing that, like, she's sort of missing the point of being in a convent. Like, the point of a convent is to remove yourself from the travails of the world. You're supposed to be pulling away from what is important to the average person and focusing solely on yourself and your day-to-day activities and the people who are there with you. And she is getting caught up in wanting to know gossip and trying to find out news. And it's just sort of like against all of the principles of why she's here. And she's just realizing she's starting to get really restless, and maybe it's time for her to move on. And I thought that was interesting because for some reason, whenever I hear that a woman's in a convent, I just assume she's been, like, stuck there. And I kind of thought that maybe she wasn't going to be able to leave. But it turns out she's free to come and go as she wishes. And this is when she talks about the truly dead, capitalized. They were the creatures in the stories who slept by day and would burst into flame at cockcrow if not safely packed in a coffin layered with their native soil. Many bore the marks of chaos, eyes like red marbles, wolfish fangs, 3-inch talons. Their feeding habits offended her polite sensibilities and caused much hostility between the convent and the few nearby woodland villages. And she mentions how she is feeding less and that she's outliving the need. So that is really fascinating to me. It's almost like she's going through vampire menopause and she's realizing that she hasn't made any new vampires herself. So she has nobody to sort of look to as carrying her lineage on in the world. And she kind of regrets it, which I thought was interesting. She's not of the type of vampire that basically thinks this is a damned existence that nobody should ever be forced to experience, and I would never inflict this on somebody else. She isn't like that. She's definitely kind of like, man, I should have done that. I'm a little bit bummed. And she has this friend who's here at the convent with her, Lady Melissa. And Lady Melissa basically is like, I mean, you could make them now, technically, but you're kind of old for it because it's way more fun when you're younger and you're able to fully enjoy them, which sounds like it makes sense to me, especially if Genevieve isn't even interested in drinking blood as often anymore, and you're hanging out with a bunch of brand new vampires who are probably pretty blood obsessed. It's going to be really boring. It's like somebody my age hanging out with teens who just want to get drunk all the time. And I'm just kind of like, whatever, let me go to bed. It just isn't going to hold the same fascination for me anymore. I'm old. I don't care, So then she talks about the libraries of the convent. Through a simple observation of her companions in the order, she had learned that there were as many species of vampire as there were of fish or cat. Some abhorred the relics and symbols of all the gods. Others entered holy orders and lived the most devout of lives. Some were brutish predators who would drain at a draught a peasant girl. Others epicures who would sip only and treat their human meals as lovers rather than cattle. Some, skilled in sorcery and wizardry, could indeed transform themselves into bats, wolves, or sentient red mist. Others could barely tie their own bootlaces. And she's asking herself what kind she is. It's been how many hundreds of years by this point, and she still doesn't really feel like she knows, and I think that's really interesting. So let's see. She might have no reflection and feel the need for blood, but her heart still beat. The truly dead were more dead than alive, essentially walking corpses. Few of them were decent. They were the bad ones, the child stealers, the throat terrors, the haunters of the grave. So this kind of reminds me, in the Dresden Files, there are different courts of vampires. So you have the Jade Court, who's very secretive, and we don't really know anything about them. You've got the White Court, who are succubi, and they feed on lust. Sometimes they feed on fear. Then there's the Red Court, which drinks blood, and underneath their skin, they have they wear what are called flesh masks, but they look like bats underneath all of that, their true aspect. And then there's the Black Court, and they are basically the true dead. They are desiccated, and they look dead from the moment that they are created, but as they get older, they become more and more dried out and husk-like, and they seem to have some of the more intense power as well in terms of magical power. But it sort of reminds me of that, except there's obviously more of a variety here. And even within the Red Court in Dresden, there are what are called blood slaves, which you would think that those are going to be people that they farm for blood. But no, what they mean is people who are vampires who are slaves to their own bloodlust and are basically not even as not even able to pretend to be human like other Red Court vampires are. And often that happens as they get older and they start to like, basically it's like vampire dementia. And so that sort of reminded me of here when there are some vampires that can't even tie their own bootlaces. They can't even create a flesh mask to hide behind. They are constantly in their natural bat-like state, and they feed at will on whoever gets near them, and they don't have any discernment about it, and they don't try and cover their tracks. They don't have a sense of self-preservation, really. So Genevieve is playing cards with Lady Melissa, and she is trying to think a few hands ahead. And Lady Melissa says, "You shouldn't try to read your granny's mind like that. She's much older and wiser than you and could easily give you the vision of the wrong cards." So that was interesting to me because I don't feel like in the earlier section we got any indication that Genevieve can read minds. And I can't tell if that's like an honest, like if we're being literal here, or if that's just meant to be a bit of a joke between the two of them. But yeah, so she and this Lady Melissa's 12 years old, by the way, and has like the curling golden hair. So of course she calls to mind, what's her name from, oh my God, I almost said The Vampire Diaries, Interview with the Vampire. But she is extremely old and just has a way about her that makes you know that she's old. She's just got an old lady vibe. And Genevieve is thinking about the effects of having been at this battle. The effects had been calamitous and unforeseen. Throughout the known world, the agents of evil were transformed into their true monstrous selves, or struck down by invisible arrows to the heart, or blasted to pieces by explosions. Basically, all of these folks were hiding, or under these like enchantments that just give up. In Gisero, the statue of a martyred child came suddenly to life, speaking in an ancient dialect no one could understand. The spell upon him at last lifted. Wild. Can you imagine you're turned into a statue and you finally come awake and you have been a statue for so long that your language literally does not exist anymore? Like, that's a real fucking bummer, man. That sucks. So yeah, there was just absolute chaos after all of this happened. And there's this emperor who refused to join in Oswald's expedition or send anybody with them. He had sent a troop of the Imperial Guard to clear out the pathetic remnants of Drachenfels' foul servants from his castle. Goblins, orcs, trolls, hideously altered humans, degenerates, and hordes of unclassifiable creatures had been put to the sword, or burned at the stake, or hanged from the battlements. And he wants to kind of just take down the entire castle. But Oswald says no, and honestly, I'm a little bit leery because I don't know that Oswald's all that. Like, I don't know. I feel suspicious about Oswald being the guy who took him down. It feels a little bit too perfect. I want to believe it, but there's a part of me that wonders if this dude isn't just biding his time. It's only been 25 years, reminder, since this happened. For some reason, I had it in my head that we jump ahead like 100 years, but no. So 25 years to like bide your time is not long at all, considering how old Drachenfels is supposed to be in the first place. It's like, you know, waiting like 2 or 3 months for us. And I just am waiting for this all to resurface again. So she says something to her friend, Lady Melissa, about how she's been dreaming. And Lady Melissa's like, bitch, that doesn't happen to vampires. What are you talking about? And she's like, yeah, exactly. It doesn't. I don't know why this is happening to me. And they get interrupted by a message from Henrik Crowley from Altdorf, who wants to speak to Genevieve. And the next day, Genevieve gets on a boat and heads to Drachenfels. And we don't know what the message contained or why she's heading back, but it can't be good. And then we go back to, and I'm out of time here, but not a ton happens in this section, so it's okay. Detlef is still in prison. He's looking at one of his like comrades who's being taken advantage of regarding food by this other dude, and he's sort of realizing that this dude is going to slowly kill all of them through starvation, and they are all going to be victims because none of them are standing up for the previous person who's being taken advantage of. They're all just letting it happen, and he's sort of realizing just how despicable they all are. And that the guy has seen that they won't stand up for any of their alleged friends, and so he will feel free to keep doing this. And I feel like that's got to be some sort of metaphor. And Detlef gets summoned for a visitor and is bathed, which it's by no means anything like gentle. He's being bathed with like snow water that's ice cold, and it has chunks of actual ice in it. And he gets given some like fresh clothes to put on. And it turns out that whoever's coming to meet him is high ranking enough that it matters that he like look decent. And it is Governor Van Sant. May I present you to Oswald von Koningswald, Defier of the Darkness, Adept of the Cult of Sigmar, Crown Prince, and Acting Elector of Ostland. And I'm like, all right, Oswald, what are you doing, though? I am not certain that I buy that you're like this amazing dude. I want you to be. I really do. But I'm very leery of you, sir. We didn't get to see the battle. I don't know that that battle happened. It might all have been an illusion. I don't know. The fact that so many enchantments went up in smoke points to me to the fact that it might be real, but I don't know what you can fake, you know? He could have been setting up this illusion for years ahead of time. I don't know. Anyway, so that is where it ends, is him being introduced to the prince. And Kyle says, those are some interesting points you're making. I try to do that, Kyle. I try to make him interesting. So, Kyle, I don't think that there is another commission on the docket for this book. I don't know if you were planning on pursuing this one or if you wanted to see if I liked it before you do go on with it or what. But get in touch with me. I have to go because this time is up. But I'm booked into November at this point, so it'll be a while if there is a second episode of this. So everybody stay tuned, and maybe I'll see you with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.